In particular, I want to talk a little bit about ESCOM and why do I want to care about this? Why do I talk about this? I mean, aside from the fact that it affects a lot of different migrant populations, immigrant workers, Latino migrants, it's also part and parcel of a general framework of profiling Muslim migrants and generally folks of color. And so there's a lot of overlap between what's happening in ESCOM and also a lot of post 9/11 law, starting from really October 1st of 2001, when the USA Patriot Act was passed, which pretty much gave the feds a lot of power to decide who would get to stay in this country, who would be free, who would be deported. And we've seen a series of laws that have pretty much gotten rid of a lot of the checks and, if you will, balances a lot of the accountability that forced the feds and the judicial system and the executive branch, the president and his folks, to have to double check, to have to review their decisions before passing laws which are affecting different kinds of populations. So that's kind of how I come into it. I think it's part of a pattern of national security law. For those of you who follow some of this stuff, you know, one of the things you might have figured out is that this is really kind of falling on the heels of a lot of other laws that have been passed even after ICE decided that secure communities was going to be a policy that they would implement. They decided to do this in October 2008. As little as 8 months ago, we have a new policy, the National Defense Authorization Act of 2012, which is ostensibly about how money gets allocated, how military budgets get allocated, but there's also a nice little clause in there that says that if there's any question about who to detain, who to arrest within the US or elsewhere, the president gets final authority. And kind of following up on that, really, secure communities is a policy that depends a lot on discretion, both from the feds but also from municipal police departments. So let me talk a little bit about what it is. It was initially introduced in October of 2008 by Immigration and Citizenship Enforcement, and the idea was that it would be a way for the FBI and ICE to get a handle on who were possible criminals among an immigrant population. So the idea is that when police stop people in the course of their routines, their daily routines, whether it's somebody for a traffic violation or even somebody who has been called into the police department under SARS, which is a suspicious activity report, the police basically have an obligation to go out and check out what it is, even if this person is doing nothing. You know, they might be sitting in their car. Somebody can call up and say, this person's been sitting in their car for the last 15 minutes, and I'm really worried that they might be a terrorist or a criminal, and they might just be listening to the end of NPR, right? And kind of railing at all things considered, but that's actually sufficient grounds to call the cops. So what ICE said was, what we want to do is we want municipal police departments, which are already obligated to send in fingerprints and data to the FBI to cross-check with immigration records. We want them to honor our detainer requests as well. So if we feel that there's some kind of suspicious activity happening, if there's some kind of suspicious activity happening, we want the cops to basically hold these folks until we can decide whether or not we want to move them into ICE detention facilities or somewhere else. Secure communities itself as a policy is pretty ambiguously worded. It's really hard to get a handle on. If you look at the web page, right, the ICE web page, they have a very nice write-up about how it's, you know, about criminal prevention and, you know, about deporting migrants in order to literally make communities safer. In fact, what it does is create a kind of atmosphere of distrust that pretty much challenges a certain kind of community policing model, which has been found to be much more effective when thinking about law enforcement in various kinds of mixed communities, diverse communities. And so it challenges that by pretty much warning anyone who has any reason to be afraid of the law, whether they're undocumented, documented, migrants, or citizens, to really think twice before calling the police. Now, in general, I think that's not a bad idea, right? I think we should think twice before calling the cops for all kinds of reasons. But what it also does is that it shuts down communication between different kinds of neighbors and different kinds of communities. So what happened in Amherst last month, and Amherst is the third city in Massachusetts to have done this, the first two being Springfield in September of last year, Northampton in February of this year, is actually get their city council to pass a resolution asking its police department, actually in some sense I suppose demanding, or as ambiguous as these things are, earnestly asking the police department to not cooperate with the feds and to think twice before doing any racial profiling, but especially also not honoring detainer requests. And initially it was introduced in Amherst, where I live, as a bylaw. And that made the select board and a bunch of folks pretty nervous, because they were afraid that if something like that passed, it was pretty much a local law that contravened federal law. There is a little codicil that allows that to happen, but the select board was very nervous about what kinds of lawsuits they would suddenly find against them and what kind of city money they'd be spending to honor this. So they downgraded this to a resolution that asks the Amherst Police Department not to cooperate with the feds and with ICE. So we were able to pass it pretty much unanimously. There was one person who spoke out against it, about 200, or who gave a nay vote, and about 249 people who said yay. So we were pretty excited about that. The other thing that it does, and I think this is really important, is that 48-hour detainer request and the practice of sending fingerprints to the FBI and to ICE is part of a national project to start collecting data on, well, not start, it's been happening for a decade, but it's really become entrenched in the last few years, to start collecting data on citizens, migrants, non-citizens, undocumented workers, you name it. And what happens is that this is kind of biometric data that's fed into a permanent FBI database. That information is actually filtered through what are fusion centers, which we know very little about, but thanks to Bill Newman, who's one of our constitutional kind of defenders up in Massachusetts and who's filed a FOIA, Freedom of Information Act, what we know is there are hundreds of municipal, literally, data warehouses where they collect information anytime you have any reason to have interacted with the law, whether it's a traffic violation, whether it's paying your taxes online, etc. And so what the Secure Communities Act does is really help to cement the centralizing of this information. So there's a piece in Color Lines magazine, which you can find online, in fact, which passed today, or which came out today, which shows how this is a deliberate part of, how Secure Communities is a deliberate part of this project. The other implication of this, it does affect all kinds of migrants, but it's also part of a 10-year, and I would argue longer, but at least we can document this, for the last 10, 11 years, part of an anti-terrorism project, right? A national security project which dovetails with an anti-immigration project. So that racial profiling has pretty much become a norm, and the idea of recording what people do has been normalized so that we don't really think twice about it. For example, this camera here is really, in some sense, there is no permission that's ever been asked, right? It's kind of done. So you've got cameras on every street corner, you've got these kinds of central databases in order to start recording this information and start directing how federal and municipal and state police authorities and immigration authorities will start tracking your movements. So one of the most effective ways that I think to kind of challenge secure communities is to somehow find a way to, as John mentioned, it happened in New Haven, is to try to get local police authorities and possibly the governor to challenge, to basically send a letter informing the feds that they will no longer be honoring detainer requests. There are different codicils that allow that to happen, but that's pretty much what is becoming the standard practice here. And I think the other thing that's really important here is that this is the kind of moment to think about the importance of coalition building. I mean, a lot of my work has been focused on Muslim men. I have roots in California, and I was on the Immigrant Commission of San Francisco for a long time, and I did a lot of work with Muslim men who were in detention. And this is a law that affects them. It affects Muslim women, it affects South Asian populations, whether or not they're Muslim. But most importantly, and even though I tried to talk about this as much as 6-7 years ago among various immigrant service providers there who worked with Latino and Central American migrants, there seems to be this kind of blindness, which says, well, anti-terrorism is really not about Latinos, anti-immigration law is really not about Muslims or South Asians. These are different animals, different breeds. But in fact, what you're seeing is secure communities as one of a long list of laws, which is really affecting brown and black people across the board, whether or not you're a migrant. In fact, under secure communities, 3,500 US citizens in the last 6 months, I believe it's 6 months, have been deported. Literally, just deported. So in the event that you think that this is really just about migrants and a certain kind of migrant, I ask you to rethink that this is the time to really start reaching out to groups across the board that you might not think you have anything in common with, and start talking about how to resist these kinds of laws, because I think it's much more effective than fighting a one-pronged battle. Thank you.